a remarkably narrow disparity between the concepts here. We can readily prove that this one-to-one-to-one relationship, it can be perpetually sustained by no more than an eradication of interest and an obligatory schedule of payment, which in the end reduces this false economy, this system of exploitation, to a system of monetized barter with the additional advantages of a universal medium of exchange. When you go to the market with a goat to trade it for a dog, you don't have to find somebody with a dog, the dog you want, who wants the goat that you have. Instead, you can sell your goat, take the money, and get the dog. It's a matter of finding only then a person who wants your goat and finding the dog you want. So these are the advantages. And of course, Bob has already raised himself the fact that Austrians recognize how a mutable currency engenders offense against people who have engaged in contracts, for instance, and particularly in promissory obligations, which virtually every contract actually is. So this is a very interesting position that he's raised, because in truth it illustrates how little the differences are and how close these other theorists have come to at least to realizing the problems that need to be resolved. It seems that if this was considered a false goal, I wouldn't know why that would be. If it was too lofty a goal, it only means that the few steps which are necessary to resolving this simple mathematic riddle haven't been engaged in. And so in truth, we can understand this by simply evaluating the cycle. We introduce $100,000 to pay for a $100,000 home during a 100-year lifespan, and if we considered linear rates of depreciation or consumption, just for the sake of simplification of understanding, then we pay $1,000 a year for the home over its lifespan. Thus, every year the remaining value of the home equals the remaining circulation. And so by maintaining this essential proportion, which the very idea of defining such a thing as circulatory inflation addresses, by solving it, we eradicate that possibility even of imposing a mutable currency. Instead, we are sustaining an immutable currency by maintaining what is in fact a natural relationship. That is, the consumer should pay for the production of others as they consume of it, and this results in a circulation which is immutable. How simple can that be?
Subjective. And so you could say, well, something that has a fixed purchasing power, but even there, that's problematic. That what if people don't, 30 years from now, don't like the objects that we tied the unit to? So, I mean,
I understand what you're saying there. What I'm saying is that the value can be immutable by maintaining a perpetual one-to-one relationship between remaining circulation and remaining value of represented property, and in relation to a further thing, which is a remaining obligation to pay just that much for the remaining value of the represented property. So I'm saying there is a way to accomplish that it's not impractical. I'm wondering, because what happens in today's world, to be frank, is people who represent Ron Paul, for instance, or support Ron Paul, are looking for a solution. They're wanting solution, and they want to believe that gold is the answer. Whereas you've just confessed, to your credit, that there's the disparate volumes which prevent it from actually providing monetary solution in a sense of an actual immutable currency. Now, yes, I agree that all the while, in a system which can maintain a perpetual one-to-one-to-one relationship between remaining circulation, remaining value of represented property, and remaining obligation to pay just that much for represented property, you have, therefore, in that perpetual one-to-one-to-one relationship, you would have an impetus for both the real creditor, who gives up property for promissory obligation, and the obligor, both, to always, and we're always either one or the other or both. The people are. We have a truly free market only when we eradicate exploitation of the currency, which is, the general state of fiat. It's a means of exploitation. So, in maintaining this one-to-one-to-one relationship, you're compelling, nonetheless, both the obligor and the real creditor who gives up property for a promissory obligation. You're compelling them both to constantly, in their own affairs, measure the value of the production of others in the relative value of their own production that they're giving up. So you're at once sustaining the only possible free market, which is freed of exploitation of interest, and at the same time, because there's always a commitment to pay for the remaining value of property with the very circulation which represents it, you're basically compelling the subjects to either recognize whatever principles serve them in determining the rightful value and price they should pay for anything. And even if you're not even enforcing that upon them, you're allowing them to say, well, I'll pay $200,000 for a $50,000 house, for instance, at their own penalty. In other words, there's still a free market. The only one who suffers the damage is the person that agrees to some damaging conditions. So, I'm kind of baffled why Austrian economics hasn't evolved beyond this dedication to gold, and instead reach for a higher concept, to me what would be a higher concept, of using the actual property that money needs to represent as the actual redeemability of the currency. In other words, you don't have just a storehouse of gold to represent all things. You have all things to represent all things. I mean, that's the natural solution, and it's the only workable mathematic solution. So how do you feel that Austrian economics relates to that? I mean, I know Ron Paul supporters, for instance, are just adamant. They come at you, that gold's the only way, but they can't say how, because we have this disparate volume of gold from the volume of represented property, which is actually undermining the very other thing that he's complaining about, which is in circulatory inflation, is a disparate volume of circulation from the volume of represented property. So, which of course circulatory inflation doesn't even necessarily exist, because we're paying principal and interest out of a circulation at such great rates that there's no credible math to just claiming that what's being loaned into circulation at greater rates than ever before somehow results in circulatory inflation, when of course what's going on around us is we have terminal indebtedness and a lack of money. You see, so these things don't make sense, and I'm not sure that they're attributable to Austrian economics, but instead to some misunderstanding of Austrian economics. And I'm just wondering if the top intellectuals of Austrian economics are are interested in actually solving this disparate volume, or are they just saying, well, that's just subjective, which I would disagree that it is, because you're actually imposing disparate volumes if you're relegating your only concept of monetization or representation to gold or precious metals or some combination thereof, you know?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure exactly what you mean, but there was a proposal. Hayek wrote a piece called "The Denationalization of Money." I think he wrote it in the late '60s, but I could be wrong about that. And it hasn't really picked up much traction. But he was basically saying, maybe we're going at this the wrong way. Maybe it's not fiat money per se that's bad. Maybe it's just a government monopoly of it, and we could imagine in an unrestricted market that certain firms could start issuing currency, their own, currencies, idiosyncratic currencies, and the pledge would just be, we're going to, maintain the purchasing power of a certain basket of commodities in terms of this unit of account, and that's all we do. And so that they would of course presumably be much better at doing that than the government is with its promises to not have price inflation. So I mean, is that what you're?
Well, it's interesting you raise that. That proposition, because I'm at odds with Hayek's paper, in which is titled. It's not actually a paper. It's I'm not sure if it faithfully follows just the text of a speech that he gave in a presentation that he gave in 1977. But the title of it's at Mises.org, is a free market monetary system. But the fact that he raises this question of whether or not gold would solve the problem, then, is another way to interpret what you just said, and how else to solve it would imply to me that at its highest levels, that Austrian economics would be at least be open, if they were faithful to Hayek's question, that they would be open to a fact of possible solution, which is, my problem is that I see people who just want so much to get rid of the Federal Reserve that they believe that Ron Paul is the solution. And there are consequences of reverting to a gold standard. He's never specified how we would even revert to this standard, much less what the consequences of that would be, much less, as he said, how those would be justified. And what I'm saying is that this is overtly malpractice of principles. In other words, I went way back in Austrian economics and read, some of the works of the founding minds, and I found that, the earliest expressions that I could find didn't say that, didn't advocate that mathematics can't be used to account for economic problems, because economics involves indeterminate human behavior. It was actually stated in the proper way, as any mathematician would tell you, and that is that mathematics can only be used to resolve determinate human behavior, absolutely, but can only be used to resolve or relate to indeterminate human behavior when the methods which are used do account for every possible exception. In other words, unless we can prove that we could account for every possible exception or further dependence on further information or manifestations, for instance, we can't say that mathematics gave us the answer. And mathematicians always know this. For instance, if we going back to our metaphor of modern ballistics, if we use a certain ballistic coefficient to determine the deceleration of a given projectile, yes, we very accurately calculate the trajectory, but that trajectory that we accurately calculate depends on an errant aerodynamic model, which means that we're not really producing the exact answer. So what a mathematician would tell you is that, well, we deviate from the proper answer so far. We know that. But so we're accurate to within whatever, so many thousandths of an inch at 500 yards or whatever. Usually the error can be known in something simple as that. And at other times, we might have indeterminate error, which means that, well, all right, we hold to this general pattern given these conditions. Beyond that, we don't know.